Great. Cool. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar series that we as DGMT are hosting in collaboration with Inspire, which seeks to inspire the renewable energy sector to take on a more strategic approach to investing in education. And it's part of a broader process of supporting a community of practice, in particularly with 5 IPPs that are based in the Eastern Cape called the Inland 5. And so, yeah, we're really excited to be part of this, and we hope that in each sort of webinar, people will walk away with some insight that will help them think about their strategies and their communities differently and hopefully create greater impact. For this particular webinar, we've got a focus on NEET, young people, so those who are neither in education, employment, or training. And we've got a wonderful panel who's going to help us really frame who these young people are, how many are there, and solutions and approaches that we can take in our very respective communities to better support young people who are NEET. But yeah, before I get into some intros of the panelists themselves, I'd like to just say, for those who are attending, I'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of this series for you to ask some questions of our panelists, but also feel free to just pop your questions in the comment box throughout the engagement, and at the end we will also just reflect on those. So do, we encourage that participation as much as possible, so that this actually can address some of your own questions. Cool. So to kick us off, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to just introduce themselves, say a little bit about who you are and the work that you do. And I'll start off with you, Kristal.
Hi everyone, I'm Kristal Duncan-Williams, and I am the project lead at Youth Capital, which is an incubated project of the DGMT Trust. It's an advocacy campaign really looking to break down the systemic barriers that young people face on their journey from learning to earning. And we really see ourselves as an amplifier of youth voices into decision-making spaces to ensure that those decisions and policies and the implementation thereof really takes into account the lived experiences of young South Africans today in 2024. I'm really excited to have this chat today. Thanks.
Cool. We're really excited to have you, Kristal, and I think helpful to have that sort of broader policy lens in this conversation too. Antonia, over to you.
So my name is Antonia Appel, and I'm the communications manager for Fetch, which is a coaching and community strengthening approach, also nested within the DGMT Trust. And we provide support to unemployed young people, specifically young people who are NEET, so not in employment, education, or training, to really support them in their well-being, their employability, and also in connecting them to services. We are of the opinion that there are just too many young people who are slipping through the cracks, and if we don't actively support them, then we run the risk of not capitalizing on kind of an ideal opportunity to break the cycle of poverty. So yeah, I'm really keen on this discussion today. I think it's critical. I think not enough is done to address the issue of NEEThood in South Africa. So thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. And I think, again, like really helpful to also have then the lens of those who are on the ground working directly with the group with young people who are NEET in this conversation. So very excited to also have you here. Bridge.
Thanks, Nazo. Hi, Bridget Hanna from the DGMT Trust, and I lead the portfolio All Young People on Pathways to Productivity. And really for us, it's thinking about how do we support young people on pathways to both skills and income generating opportunities. So very, very interested in the discussion today. Thanks.
Thanks, Bridge. And again, I think just to frame who we've got in the room here, I think what's really exciting about having you, Bridge, in this conversation is that you do sit in a similar position that most of us in the renewables space sit in, which is that of a funder in a sense, right? And so really helpful to also have that lens being brought into this conversation. Cool. Let's start off by framing the problem. And maybe Kristal, I mean, Youth Capital has done a lot of research to really sort of understand the size of the issue, the problem, and the nature of the problem and the root causes. Maybe you can kick us off by just telling us a little bit about, how many young people are NEET in South Africa, and what are some of the drivers of this issue?
So the number of young people not in employment, education, or training between the ages of 15 and 34, if we line them up sort of shoulder to shoulder, like a queue at the bank, that line would stretch, if you went in a straight line, all the way from Cape Town to Lagos, Nigeria. So to just take a second and just picture all of these young people whose skills and talents and aspirations we as a country are losing out on. And as we think about NEET in our conversation today, I don't want those joining us to think that NEET means, nothing, they're doing nothing, they're sitting at home. Young people are not idle and they are not doing nothing. But we are losing out on all the things they could be doing if we just supported them into income generating opportunities a little bit better. And, if you want to think about how we as a country got here, I think for a long time, an oversimplification of what youth unemployment is, that there's going to be one magic silver bullet, entrepreneurship, this government program, this intervention. We just got young people into a training program. If we just got young people in entrepreneurship, if we just. And that's just not the case. We're going to speak about NEET as though they're one thing, and they're not. And because they're this heterogeneous group of young people, there's no single intervention that's going to address the scale of the crisis. All those 9 million young people, there's not going to even be two solutions to address the problem. And I think the other reason that, we've struggled, one, not understanding the complexities of the youth experience and not incorporating young people's voices into decision-making spaces. I think decision makers expect us to engage with policy in a very traditional way, and that's not the way that young people engage with the world. And we don't do enough to meet young people where they are, to engage and to learn from that and ensure that policies and decisions are based in evidence and best practice as it lives in community, and just not in some sort of broad national scale. And then lastly, at Youth Capital, we really think a lot of the work in youth development has been quite siloed, and there's been repetition. And I don't think there's a lack of necessarily funding. I think there's just too much duplication and not learning from each other and not building on each other's lessons, whether those be successes or failures, and then forming sort of a pipeline across the different interventions. But rather that there's this idea that this program will work, and then, a whole bunch of people put money into that thing without looking at other programs at a local level that actually might have been done that's doing the same thing with, 20 young people and have learned a whole lot, but we don't even know about it. So, breaking down those silos, incorporating the youth voice, and understanding that it's a complex problem that needs complex solutions, and being okay with that, I think are, some of the things we should think about and where we've missed the mark historically.
Sure, that's such helpful framing of the problem, right? And also just astounding the size of the problem. This idea of from Cape Town to Lagos. I mean, that's quite a number, right? And you've started touching on, we got here because we also think about, and we continue to stay stuck here because we think about these young people as this heterogeneous or homogenous rather group, right? Which is the problem. And obviously then the interventions tend to be looking for a silver bullet or undermining the complexity and the need therefore for a collaborative approach. That is mind-blowing framing and helpful framing to kick us off. And so I guess, Antonia, working directly with these group of young people, I wonder if you could help to unpack a little bit further this idea of who they are and the fact that they aren't this homogenous group, right? And what are they doing, and what is their lived experience? If you can take us in to that so that we can better understand why solutions, when we get to that place, need to be of a particular nature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and as you and Kristal have mentioned, I mean, this is not a homogenous group of young people. They come from different backgrounds, whether that's sort of geographically, racially, culturally, even in terms of education level. But interestingly enough, even though the NEET group is diverse, there are certain patterns that emerge, particularly when we kind of segment it according to gender. And in South Africa in particular, young Black women, if I can say, are disproportionately affected by NEET status. And this is between the ages of 20 and 24 in sort of peri-urban and urban areas. And, there's multiple reasons why this is the case. And there was a study that was done by UN Women, apologize for that, a study done by UN Women a couple of years ago. And they determined that young women, whether they dropped out of high school or they went on to matriculate, they end up having to take on these sort of family responsibilities or caregiving responsibilities. And this ultimately just locks them out of potential or future learning and earning opportunities, particularly if a job takes them away from the family environment. So, without access to sort of higher education or any kind of vocational training, they just find themselves stuck in this NEET status. And it can end up being something permanent, and a lot of the time we see it extending beyond that sort of traditionally accepted 15 to 24 year group, sometimes upwards of 30, 35 years that this NEET status can continue. But, when we're looking at NEEThood broadly, we recognize that there are obviously multiple factors that contribute to NEET status in South Africa. For starters, there 70% of NEET youth live in income poverty. Half of them don't have a matric. But it's not just also about the qualification status, there's a multitude of kind of overlapping systemic issues that they face. And these are the kind of structural, these structural issues kind of prevent them from progressing and push them further into isolation. On the one hand, they've got these caregiving responsibilities, which ultimately pulls them away from the job market. And then on the other hand, they're also kind of battling with a lack of guidance and not knowing really where to go or to begin when it comes to finding a job or kind of pursuing any other kind of education. So just from our work within the various communities that we operate in, we've seen these challenges firsthand, and the young people that have come through our coaching program, whether they're from the urban or the rural communities, they often tell us how discouraged and how isolated they feel. And about a quarter of the group that we actually engage with have completely given up on looking for a job. And this is because the system has let them down so many times. And that's just a reality for a lot of these young people. And then compounded on top of this isolation and discouraging sort of discouraging mentality, is this anxiety and depression that these young people feel, their mental health struggles. So when young people kind of remain in NEET status for extended periods of time, there's obviously this risk of economic and social exclusion. And the trauma of this exclusion it doesn't go away. Throwing a job at it is not going to make problems disappear. And for many of the young people, the trauma actually shows up in how they relate to others. So they struggle to form kind of lasting relationships with people, whether it's with their family members or in social circles. They have difficulty managing their emotions. They're easily kind of triggered or provoked. Others just, tend to zone out and are kind of unaffected by these sort of external stimuli. And obviously these are coping mechanisms, as a consequence of their environment. And, they're kind of ways to deal with this sort of helplessness and the stress that they feel. But ultimately, without any kind of intervention, these behaviors can really hold them back from progressing. But, it's not all doom and gloom. So despite this, there are 75% of this group who are actively looking for work. And you can see that they've got this sort of positive aspect. They're they want to progress. They want to envisage a future for themselves where they succeed. And like Kristal mentioned, you know, that stereotype of young people not wanting to work, young people are lazy. It's simply not true. It's not because there's a lack of will. I think it's a lack of support. There's a willingness, there's a desire for a better life, but many of these young people just don't have the resources or even the basic information to take, you know, the next step. So I think, yeah, you know, just to kind of round it off, one of the important takeaways for me is that when you are looking at NEET youth, I think, you know, one shouldn't look at it in terms of, okay, 15 to 24 years. I think you need to look at it a little bit long term, sort of in age group, because a lot of the young people that we see, they have degrees. You know, these are young people who've gone to university, so they've had kind of that opportunity, but now they're stuck in this kind of limbo about how to move forward. What happens beyond this degree? How do I take that next step forward? So yeah, that's just kind of a very broad overview of the young people that we've engaged with.
Yeah, very helpful, and particularly helpful in humanizing the group of young people that we're talking about here. Bridget, I wonder if there's any additional kind of framing that you think is quite important to bring to this conversation at this point.
Thanks, Nazo. You know, I think one of the unique opportunities at DGMT, both being a funder but a funder implementer, is the opportunity that we have to both think in the policy space and at the intersection with government, as well as we can learn from the front line of implementation to really understand what it's going to take to put young people on a fundamentally different trajectory. And I think the key for us is really building on what Kristal and Antonia have both shared, is that we have to put young people at the center of our solutions. I think that too often, and this really is just echoing what both Antonia and Kristal have shared, is that too often we speak about young people rather than engaging with where they are and how we're then going to change anything about their trajectory. So I think from a funder perspective, really that's what we have to keep coming back to, is if our solutions are not creating change for the young person, then we have to look at what our solutions are and move from there.
Sure, that is excellent, and a great segue then to talking about solutions. Antonia, I know Fetch did extensive research in coming up and designing the program itself, and you begin a lot of your work in communities when you enter new communities with engaging young people. And I wonder if you could just give us a sense of, based on that initial research that informed your design of the program in general, and as well as what you're finding as you enter new communities, what are you finding works in terms of supporting young people? And maybe if you could even touch on, like, what did you find from that initial research might not work as a solution for helping young who are NEET?
Yeah. Look, so we were kind of in a fortunate position where, there was extensive research that was done on NEEThood in South Africa, and we also borrowed from the EU guarantee, which was essentially designed in response to youth unemployment in Europe, and so that model was adapted to fit the South African context. But you know, across the board, the research consistently shows that youth programs that offer holistic, personalized, and ongoing support have far better outcomes. And over the years, the individualized coaching and combined with community strengthening approaches have proven to make a real difference in young people's lives. So just to give you, I guess some insights into the work that we've done. With the coaching approach specifically, we conducted an 18-month pilot study a year or two ago with academic partners across 4 different regions in South Africa. And what we the observations were incredible. So what we observed was that even after 4 coaching sessions, there was a 40% reduction in the number of young people who were NEET. And that's a pretty staggering figure. If you think about a session taking place once a week, so that's 4 sessions over 4 weeks, that's a 40% reduction in a 4-week turnaround time, which is incredible. That's obviously not always the case, because these programs are kind of tailored to the individual's needs. It's not one size that fits all for each of these individuals. And then one of the other interesting things that we noticed was, mental health indicators. So this GAD, the generalized anxiety disorder indicator, that dropped from sort of 37% down to 22% after 3 sessions. And there was an overall increase in young people feeling supported, feeling heard, feeling as though they have access to services and are supported by services and their community, and also sticking with these learning and earning opportunities that they're often referred to. And I guess ultimately the results highlight that, young people, when they are actually provided with the right kind of support, and this is support that acknowledges the multiple challenges that they face, it normalizes their fears, it builds their autonomy. The impact is profound, and I think all because it's a self-led, empowering process. And if I can just quickly go into, there's kind of, we've spoken about the coaching intervention, which seems to have really profound impact on young people. But then there's also the community strengthening approach, the community building approach. And this is really around ensuring that the community where these young people are found in are really equipped to support them. So it's not enough just to coach an individual. We need to ensure that the services around them are actually strong enough to help them thrive. And what we find with other kind of NEET interventions or programs is that they often only focus on trying to equip the young person to succeed in a broken system, instead of looking at the system and saying, okay, how can you repair yourself in order to be able to hold this young person so that they can thrive. So when it comes to community building, it's working closely with local service providers, with potential employers, community leaders, and then obviously having the young person at the center of it all. And really, it's just closing the gap. But I don't want to take up too much time about that. But if I can just touch briefly on the things that we found that haven't, or perhaps challenges, not necessarily things that haven't worked. I think there's a disconnect between short-term funding cycles and the long-term nature of the work. Because as we all know, real kind of sustainable change, it doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lead time of sometimes 5 to 10 years to kind of fully embed practices and to see lasting results. So that's something to consider. And then the other one is really just making sure that the community, or rather ensuring that the community is part of the process. It's important that, it's important that that any kind of intervention doesn't come into the community and kind of come in there with kind of a ready-made plan. You have to build trust, you have to co-create solutions, put young people at the center, and make the community feel like they're really part of the process. And of course, this kind of buy-in takes time, but it's necessary. So yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. And you're kind of already touching on things that I want to double click on later when you talk about certain principles. So if you could keep those last 2 points about the long-term nature and the processes for community engagement up front, in mind, that would be really great. But I just want to, for the benefit of those who might not be as familiar with what you're referring to when you say coaching, can you just give us a sense, like, in layman's terms, like what is that intervention? What does that look like?
Yeah, so at the heart of it, this individual or sort of personalized coaching is about getting young people to know themselves better. I mean, it sounds pretty simplistic, but that's exactly what it is. So that's helping them identifying what their strengths are, what their skills are, and even their dreams. It's not just about helping them find a job. And this is one of the things that is also a challenge for us. When young people come and kind of engage with the program, the expectation is that, okay, well, now you're going to help me find a job. And that's not it. It's taking the young person through the journey. It's helping them kind of craft a future where they can work, where they can basically see themselves succeed. So the process starts by helping them identify sort of their personal goals, understanding the challenges that they face, and then developing an action plan that's tailored to their specific needs. And like I said before, this process can take anywhere from 1 month to 9 months because it's really dependent on the young person. And at each stage, so there are 4 different sessions, but each session is essentially a stage in this journey. But here's, I think, the crucial part is that once this young person is referred, they're not left completely on their own devices. The coaches actually stay involved in their kind of future development. They're constantly checking in on them, making sure that they've got the support that they need. And I think that's key. It's one thing to kind of have an intervention that can help young people, but you have to have this constant kind of long-term support in order for them to really succeed. They always have to feel as though they are being held, whether it's within the community or whether it's through this kind of intervention. And that's why I'm going back to this idea of this long-term sustainability and this long-term funding cycle, because if you come in there with kind of this 3-year plan, it's very difficult. These are young people that have been severely marginalized, have real issues building relationships, trusting authority figures. And if you just come in there, come and leave as quickly as you come in, you're basically leaving that young person dead in the water. So that's essentially the program.
Thanks for touching on that. Kristal, could you share a bit from your guys' research, and what are sort of some of the emerging things that you're finding are critical for you to be advocating for at a policy level for young NEETs?
Sure. So, Youth Couple has been around for nearly 7 years now. And in that time, we obviously, exactly to my first point, it's a complex, what do you focus on? How do we kind of divide and conquer the work? And through that, we've come up with the 3 key things we want to be focusing on for the next 5 years. We saw the elections as really a moment to say, what are we going to ask of this next administration? And so those 3 things are, ensuring that public employment programs work for young people. The second thing is that young people are equipped with 21st century work skills. And the third, that young people have easier and increased entry points into the labor market. And here we're really talking about small and medium businesses. And the reason we've chosen these 3 is because 8 in 10 unemployed young people have never had a job. And this idea, and you hear it from young people again and again, and I'm sure Antonia will back me up here from her work as well. You need work to get work, but you can't get work unless you've had work before. And so this kind of like catch-22 that young people find themselves in every time they apply for anything. And as the queue gets longer and longer, employers can become pickier and pickier. And so public employment programs are really important to, one, give young people access to a work experience, a first work experience. It gives them access to social networks that they wouldn't have had otherwise. They connect them into other opportunities. It also puts money in their pockets. We've seen studies that show that, even after the short-term work opportunity ends, which is often the pushback we hear on public employment programs, they're just opportunities, they're short-term, it's a waste of money. It's not a waste of money when done well. the increased spending power of that young person and the impact on their family and the township economy surrounding them has been shown in research. And so we need to think about public employment programs in those key ways. And then why 21st century skills? We're churning out more graduates than we ever have before, and yet our graduate unemployment rate is not our biggest concern, but it is steadily increasing in the background. And even then, we're finding employers saying we just can't find the right young person. We're too scared to hire young people that don't have the skills we want. So this kind of disconnect between what employers say and then if you look at the numbers of graduates, is something that needs to be addressed. What are the areas where we can upskill young people, and understanding what those are, and then understanding the roles of government institutions in this. Employers will speak about the horror stories dealing with CETA. Young people will speak about the horrors of dealing with NSFAS. And so unless we get these mechanisms to work properly, even if we have great training programs for 21st century skills, the pathway of getting young people through that and getting them to an employer, won't function if the government institutions that support that process don't work. And then lastly, we know that, big corporates have done a lot and created a lot of employment, but we haven't really thought about what does it take to support small and medium businesses to absorb more young people, or what does it take for a young person to take something that's, this hustle, this gig economy, the changing nature of work. What support does a NEET young person need to get from a state of need into a self-income generating opportunity? What are the mechanisms of support? And then, for the small and medium businesses that might be hiring young people, what are the mechanisms we aren't, maybe leveraging as well as we could? Things like the employment tax incentive, funds from the skills levy through CETAs, these kinds of things, which Youth Capital knows from its research is something that small and medium businesses do not access because they don't understand it. It's too cumbersome. They see it as a waste of time or resources. They don't have HR resources to do those applications. And so through our work, we really decided to focus on these three things that I think speak about that journey of a young person from a state of no work experience and no job into some kind of sustainable livelihood at the end of all of that. And we've workshopped this, across the country. We had a roadshow over Feb, March, and April this year. We went into communities across 6 provinces to kind of workshop these ideas and understand at a community level what these very big policy things might look like and how they actually impact communities at the other end of the scale.
Sure, that is so helpful, and I'm so glad you touched on the enterprise and SMME component, because I think there's a lot of investment that's happening in the sector around that particular space, and it would be helpful, I know, for a lot of practitioners in the renewable space to understand how do we think about SMME investments in a way that can support NEEThood. And so, yeah, I think certainly I didn't mention this up front, but we would love to share resources and contacts of the various projects and resources of research and stuff that has been referenced in this particular webinar, so that the sector can sort of have a better understanding of some of that detail, because we won't obviously be able to cover everything in detail here. But you also mentioned this idea of generally skilling, and I know that Bridge, your portfolio has thought quite a bit about this idea of skills as a critical component for supporting young people to pathways to productivity. Can you please touch on how you guys have thought about this, where you've landed in terms of how you want to approach the skilling component?
Sure, thanks. As I'm sitting here listening to the discussion, there's so many threads to pull on, and so many rich stories that sit behind some of the stats and just some of the gems so we've particularly focused on demand-led skilling, and in its simplest form, it is building on the idea that we need to be ensuring that the kinds of skills that young people participate in are the kinds of skills that are ultimately in demand for where there's the opportunity to be absorbed by the labor market. And this, it might seem so simple, but so often the skills opportunities that are provided sit away from this tangible understanding of where the work sits. And I'm careful not to say jobs, but the work. because one of the big lessons that, and recent research coming out of Stats SA shows that participation in work is the biggest predictor of continued participation in work. Again, it seems so simple, but what we really have to be making sure is that the skills, the time that it takes to participate in a skills opportunity has the smallest bridge to being able to then participate in work. And we've been really lucky that the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention has taken the lead on driving work streams around demand-led skilling in order to understand where is the demand sitting. And they've got five different work streams, and it might be helpful that I just quickly name them, which is the automotive sector, installation, repairs and maintenance, digital skills, as well as global business services. So that's sort of what we refer to as call centers, the agriculture sector and social services. And so these five different work streams have been set up to really understand, first of all, what is the supply-demand balance, and then what kind of skilling opportunities do we need to hone out that make sure that we're bridging supply and demand. And this does go beyond just your sort of secondary and tertiary institutions. It will lean on where there are private training institutions. And at sometimes it's the actual providers. So for example, some of our large web service providers are sometimes best situated to offer these skills because, for example, digital skills are so adaptive and so fast moving. And so the space of demand-led skilling is certainly teaching us a lot about who is best to offer the skills. And then I think the other nuance that is so important, that where demand sits looks different in different spaces. So this becomes hugely geographically based. So the idea that we are skilling for, you have to be thinking about, well, skilling for where? Are we sitting rurally? Are we sitting urban? Are we sitting peri-urban? It wouldn't help to skill on something that is perhaps more focused on where there's a harbor if you're sitting in the center of the country. And so it does really require us to think quite carefully. And then if one layers the discussion around the deep personal work that's required as well, it isn't just about hard skills, technical and vocational skills. It's also about thinking about these interpersonal skills and the internal work that we have to do to support young people to then be able to grab hold of the opportunities once they exist.
Oh my gosh, this is so lovely. It's like a warm hug, because I guess, I mean, I'm sitting here with like the hat of being, managing funds for community development. And what I'm hearing is that nationally, there seem to be these opportunities that seem relevant at a global level, but certainly, and maybe one can sort of learn more and tap into those resources to figure out to what extent do any of those national opportunities resonate in our specific communities. But I'm also getting a framework for thinking about my strategy around skilling in my communities, which says to me that I need to understand what local demand is. And it says that I mustn't just think about it as hard skills that then would a hard skills kind of component. Whatever partner that I work with in meeting that demand, there has to be a soft element, because again, it goes back to what Antonia says in humanizing who are young people that are NEET, right? There has to be a level of kind of this sensitivity to the healing that they require and they need, and the gentleness in which they need to be held, given the trauma of what it has meant to be in NEEThood for so long. And so, yeah, this is just such a helpful framing of solutions for addressing NEEThood. Moving from that then to like, okay, we're not here necessarily to punt any particular program or approach here. And so I think what would be helpful to give the sector is principles, right? So if we agree on sort of these kind of the strategic framing of solutions, the need for what coaching and service strengthening, demand-led skilling, thinking about SMEs, etc., and how to think about that work in a humanized way. What are the principles we can take on that would help us sort of support this work well. And I maybe want to start with you, Antonia, because you already started to touch on too, this idea of long-term partnership being required. So maybe can you kick us off in really framing, what do you think are principles we need to embrace?
Yeah. Look, I mean, so I guess the kind of solutions that we've discussed, they sketch I wouldn't say necessarily like a simple solution, or they seem fairly straightforward, right? But when it comes to implementation on the ground, it's a completely different story. It's far more complex. And I think in one of the prep discussions, we kind of highlighted the fact that you can't have this cookie cutter approach. What works for one community is not necessarily going to work for another. So I think one of the first things, is this kind of long-term commitment, and then this element of flexibility, right? Because again, change doesn't happen overnight. And it takes time to build trust. It takes time to shift mindsets. And even just to create sustainable kind of opportunities. Because, the issues that these young people are facing are deep-rooted, and sometimes they can take sort of generations to overturn. So any kind of intervention must have a long-term vision. So with that being said, it's not enough to think in these kind of short-term cycles. There's got to be kind of a patience to stick through the program, stick rather through an intervention, even when there are challenges that will inevitably happen. And so that's why I think the flexibility element is key. You've got to adapt to the local kind of context and the evolving needs of these young people. And so rigid approaches are just they're not going to have the kind of success that they want to. And then that leads me to the second principle that I think is key, is this idea of community-led and context-sensitive approaches. Any intervention, development intervention, has to be community-led. There was this beautiful term that came out of a focus group that we conducted in the Northern Cape. One of the service providers, when asked about how they felt about their community, they said, "For us, by us." And that's exactly what any development intervention that comes into a community needs to kind of adopt, because no two communities are the same, and the community must be co-creators in any kind of solution for themselves. So it's kind of making young people, if you're looking at NEET challenges, it's putting young people at the center of any kind of intervention, but then having this kind of community collective, right? So where you have service providers, community leaders, and even employers having a say in any kind of program, and kind of letting them have a sense of ownership. I think people who are directly involved in co-creation have a sense of ownership, and you're likely to have far better outcomes, I think, if that's the case. And then the last thing is, I think, this idea of building a network of support, and that I've touched on kind of already. But you've got to recognize that you need an ecosystem of support for young people, and that can. There are going to be multiple actors, so you're going to include your coaches, you're going to include your schools, your service providers, etc. And I guess creating a shared vision, that everybody's kind of on the same page, everybody's working towards the same goal. So
what's really interesting about what you're sharing there, Antonia, is that you guys are a program that is largely based in Cape Town, but you work in these various communities. And so it's interesting that you're saying, it has to be for communities, by communities. And so you're introducing this idea that outsiders can come into new communities and spaces and still work in a way that has deep community ownership, deep community co-creation, and empowers communities to also still lead the change while you bring something to the table too. So, and I think that I've got a question about like making that practical. What does that look like to actually then do that as an outsider? And how can what does it look like practically for funders to support a program that comes from outside to land in a new community in a way that honors all of the principles you've shared?
Yeah. Look, I think at the outset, it's important to get a sense upfront from the community what it is that they need. Because even as a coaching program, we can have a plan of what we think could work, but that might look very different when it comes to implementation. So again, as simplistic as it sounds, you've got to have the community on board sort of every step of the way. So even as an external funder or an external organization that comes in, you've got to ensure that you've got the buy-in of those community members. And even something like, when you do mobilizations with young people who go out, and we call them youth igniters, who go out and they recruit young people to be part of the program. It's about making use of local resources to actually implement a program. So you can have a concept, you can have an approach, you can have an initiative that you want to fund, but it's so important that the community is kind of invested in it by either so if I can use an example of Northern Cape that we are currently busy with, we've just appointed an implementing partner. And this implementing partner is nested within the community. So they're already providing kind of youth services within the community, but they're taking an approach and they're applying it in their community context. And I think that's what makes this kind of thing work. We can kind of come in with an approach, but then there's a local implementing partner. There's a local kind of involvement. The young people who are igniters are young people that we've recruited from the community. So at every step of the process, community engagement is key. Your community stakeholders must be fully engaged at all times.
Wonderful. And it's great to know that like there are programs that sort of have the capacity and the instinct to like embed these practices in their way of working, Antonia. Bridge, I wonder if you could add to that. From a funder's perspective, what are some of the principles that you are finding are really critical to supporting this work?
Thanks. One of the other things I was thinking about as you were recounting that example, Antonia, is how important it also is, and Snazo, I know this is something that you think about a lot, is the due diligence process of actually bringing in and doing that matching of external with local partners. And I think of how often our perception of who the right partner may be is not framed through local experience, and it's only through thoughtful and intentional due diligence that, for example, you find the right partner who is values aligned and who perhaps most critically in supporting young people who were already feeling vulnerable, that they trust that that partner is going to look out for them and look out for their best interests. So I think that has been such a critical lesson reflected back about how to partner external expertise and resources with then making sure that it lands in community, so that's essentially where it lives. It's just, I see you jumping in this, Nuzzle.
No, it's a powerful one, and I think I'm just mindful of time, and I want to leave time for questions. But and I will hold my question for following up from that, and until then, Kristal, could you tie this up for us and help us go beyond then the programmatic and the individual funder, and help us understand how should we think about how these efforts that we have at a community level and as funders, private sector stakeholders, link in to the broader policy conversation around needs?
And I think to kind of close the conversation nicely, we all have our roles to play in this work, right? I started out by saying it's complex and people work in silos, and that's part of the problem. And as we kind of think about solutions, as we wrap up this conversation, to think, well, solutions also means understanding that we all have unique roles to play, and how do we pair up with each other a little bit better. And so I'm going to, use Fetch as an example because they're on the call and we're partner organizations already. But to say, they're in community. Youth Capital is a small team. It's an advocacy campaign. We're not focused on delivering programs to young people, but the experiences from the programs that do work with young people are critical. Our work would fall flat without it. So understanding from Antonia all of the insights and the stats that she gave earlier around what young people are experiencing in community, and then using that to shape what we say, to parliamentarians who often are completely oblivious. We think that they're decision makers and they're MPs and they understand the stuff, and they really don't. And when we say, well, these young people can't show up for work because it costs 1,400 Rand a month on average for young people to look for work, and they go, oh my gosh, if you think that the SRD is only 350 Rand, where are young people getting this 1,400? And so the experiences from these programs are to say, well, actually, the policy says we should do it like this and we should implement it like this. But in our experience, that doesn't work. Government says they're going to put money into public employment programs, but they're not going to put any money into M&E, and they're not going to put any money into training. All the money is going to go towards stipends. And you're like, yes, young people do need the money in their pockets, but if we're not monitoring and evaluating what we're doing, whether we're a big national government campaign or, a community-based organization, how can we learn? So I think that monitoring and evaluation, and then putting that whatever insights you have, whether it be hard numbers or just stories from people who have gone through the process, putting that into a space where organizations like Youth Capital can say, we've seen 50 organizations do this in their local municipalities. And from these 50 organizations, we can clearly make these 3 clear policy recommendations. That makes our work a lot easier to be able to just pull it all together. And it strengthens what we're saying, because a lot of the time we know it from having conversations with people. But if you can't come up with hard facts, say organization X in, rural Northern Cape, where they're so many kilometers from the economic center and young people have to spend 5,000 Rands to travel into town to go and apply at the TVET, which is completely unrealistic. What can we do to make that process better? How can we make it online? How can we, think about access and data divide and all of those things? And then you get into the real conversation. And so Youth Capital is really a conduit between the lived experiences on the ground and then these big national spaces. And I think Antonia also mentioned, we can't speak about changing, implementing a program at a community level without thinking about the system which in that community sits. So, something that resonated so much from the team at Youth Capital and the Roadshow is how much corruption, we think about these big numbers and these big figures, and every week there's a new corruption scandal in this country, but how much that really impacts, the municipalities' ability to deliver on basic services like sanitation and rubbish cleanup, and that the library actually opens and has computers that work and has the free Wi-Fi that libraries are supposed to have, and how that really affects young people's ability to access income generating opportunities. And so linking these really big national things that sometimes go over our heads with what's really happening on the ground is really what Youth Capital does. And we can only do that if the people on the ground are communicating those things to us.
Amazing, because then that kind of empowers us to say, as we fund programs and we learn from the ground, that we should really take those learnings as gold for input into organizations and teams like yours, who can do something and advocate for change at a policy level. We've got one question, and I'm not sure, it's not directed at anyone in particular, but Nomfundo, if you want to just unmute yourself and maybe ask this question, or let me know who you're directing it to. But it is, what are some examples of successful partnerships of doing this work in communities, especially for funders? I don't know, Nomfundo, if you can unmute yourself. But that functionality might not be there, but that's a question, especially for funders. What are examples of successful partnerships for doing this work? Who would like to take that one?
I actually I thought maybe to reflect. Oh, Nomfundo, it looks like maybe you can unmute yourself.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I think I am interested from the side of the funder in terms of how do funders ensure that collaboration to avoid duplication how do you make sort of strategic decisions around where best to intervene? But I'm also curious from the organizations that are doing the work themselves to just say, how do you begin to collaborate together in terms of ensuring that the work is able to meet whatever you are trying to do? Because we're looking, as you are saying, in terms of the renewable energy sector, where you have IPPs that are operating in one area, there's 3 or 4 of them. What can they do to ensure that they are more collaborative? And where are the different entry points? Is it at a strategy level? Is it at M&E level? Of just ensuring that those resources are maximized rather than either replication. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in. You know, I was reflecting on a particular example, Nomfundo, about where, because of the community of practice approach, you know, you can, and just reflecting on the Fetch team's lessons in a community in Atlantis, was a young woman had gone through the coaching process, but was struggling to make her coaching sessions because she couldn't find childcare to then do the coaching sessions and work seek. Because of the community of practice, the local ECD center realized that the barrier was non-fee payment. And because the young woman couldn't pay for fees, she couldn't drop her child off at the ECD, which meant she couldn't attend the coaching, and then she couldn't work seek. And being able to have the ECD center as part of that community of practice meant that all they did was they delayed fee payment for work-seeking moms. And I think as a funder, backing interventions that realize that you could spend a huge amount of resources and energy focusing on the individual while not supporting the community that individual walks out into. Or you could focus on a community, but not focus on the individuals in the community. You would only be doing half a job. And so I think from our perspective, in terms of our funding approach, it's realizing that there is, because one of the things I think as a funder as well is you're challenged with the idea of scale, which often means geographic or quantity scale, but not necessarily depth. And so I think one of the things that we have to challenge ourselves on and challenge others on is this concept of understanding what depth means, which is not just time, but it's also the what are the things that change a person's ability to own their own trajectory. And that's both internal work, but also strengthening around them.
Sorry, I just want to, maybe Antonia, you can answer the point around what's the point at which you collaborate? Is it at the vision level? So when you bring the communities of practice together, is it at a vision? Is it at a strategy? Do you collaborate around an indicator? What's the thing that holds that community of practice together?
So I think it's, first and foremost, it's understanding that I think everybody who comes together kind of has, so maybe it is strategic. I think the youth collective, which is kind of, so just to make the distinction between the community of practice, we've now kind of moved away from that, and we formed a youth collective, which is a little bit more integrated than a COP. And I think it comes at the point before implementation for us. So it's kind of service mapping. It's looking what are the services that are available to support young people in the communities, and then how can those services work together. And I think it's kind of critical that that group kind of works collaboratively to kind of identify what the challenges are that young people are facing. So it's almost the first thing that needs to take place. This collective must be convened to decide what must happen for the future of the community. So yeah, it's 100% strategic because anything that flows out of that collective, that's kind of the decision-making, action-orientated arm of this entire approach. So yeah. it's kind of the first thing that needs to take place.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We are out of time, and so I'm going to wrap it up here, but I think there's, I'm sure, a lot more questions, and I will commit to us finding a way to sort of solicit more of those questions and then maybe package even case studies or something outside of this particular webinar to be able to address some of the questions that the sector is sitting with. But thank you to our wonderful panelists for such a rich and insightful engagement, and thank you to our attendees for the question and the engagement. I think that was such a beautiful question, and I really hope that people will have taken away something that can help them do this work a little bit better. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Cheers.
Thanks, Anaza.